Yes. Cheers. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Scottish Testing Group meetup on the occasion of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Diversity and inclusion is at the heart of the topic of accessibility. I was actually trying to think of a quote to share on this occasion. I'm sure there are many, but the one I quite like is by renowned design researcher, Jutta Treviranus. It goes, "Diversity is the world's biggest asset, and inclusivity is our biggest challenge." It is indeed a challenge yet to be addressed by human society, and we all have our own role to play in making it happen. We have with us today 4 outstanding professionals who are experts, achievers, and champions of the area of digital inclusion. It is my pleasure and privilege to be the host of the panel discussion for this event featuring David Murdoch, Jon Gibbons, Mark Palmer, and Paul Alexander. I welcome all our esteemed panelists to the event today. And before I start the discussion, I meant to mention that we are going to collect audience vote on which topic you would like this wonderful panel to pick up for discussion. The top 2 topics will be taken up for discussion today. So I've shared the link in the chat area of the Zoom meeting. So please feel free to take a moment to go ahead and cast your vote. And with that, I'd like to start the session by handing over to our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and share some thoughts on the topic. So we'll start with David Murdoch. David, please, if you would like to come in.
So I've been, you had to pick me first. I've been working in accessibility since 2003. I got into it out of a request from university and just never left. I really don't know what to say about myself. I'm horrible at talking about myself. I don't know what to say. I'm really not. I've been doing it a long time. I tend to keep myself out of the limelight. Why did I agree to this? I don't know.
I think you'll be brilliant. No,
I don't know. I say I've been doing it for a while. Met Sowmya Ramesh, and then I went off and worked at Apple for a bit, and I'm currently a principal consultant for Test Partners. I've done work for government, private, charity sectors throughout my career. And if there's anything else you want to know, you want to ask me questions. All right.
Cheers. Thank you, David. Thanks very much. If I can request Jon Gibbons to please come in now.
Sure. Hi. I mean, I like David said, I always think of university when I think of why I sort of got into accessibility, and I guess it's always good. I always find it good to know why somebody's why accessibility is personal to you or important to you, and for some it's very obvious. If you're a person with a lived experience of disability, of course it's important to you, but I think that for me, I've always been a techie geek and wanted to use techie geek skills for good, and it was doing a degree in electronic engineering. I was working in music technology as well. I did a kind of combo degree, and I wrote music software that disabled musicians could use to compose and perform music. And it was something that I usually think of as my sort of experience of accessibility and working with disabled people that made me realize that as a techie geek, I could enable access to something that I love, which is music. And I've grown up coding. I was building websites as a student to make money, so accessibility was an obvious thing for me to learn. I'm self-taught, and I was lucky to stumble across a certain group of people on a little-known forum called Accessify Forum back in 2003, 2004, and learned a lot about it. But I really didn't think about my mum, who was blind. When I sort of started to think about why it was important to me to be to be working in the accessibility field. I started to think back to my sort of early experiences, and I usually show people this that's sat beside me. It's a talking alarm clock that I got when I was about 11 or 12. You press the top and it tells you the time in a very, well, admittedly horrible robotic American voice. But it was something that when my mum lost her sight, she went blind when I was about 13. And I was able to give that to her, and she was able to do something she was no longer able to do, tell the time. So these sort of early experiences really, I guess, stuck with me. And I think it's important to, if you're not a person with lived experience of disability, to understand it in some way, to make it ingrained in what you do. I always think of accessibility as being a quality of the work that we do. And a practice. So yeah, I think it's something that we should think, or anybody working in any field, let alone tech, should be thinking about. But it's sadly, unfortunately, very often left to the sidelines. So yeah, I'll shut up at that point. But that's kind of where I came from in the early days of accessibility, and I've been working in the field for 20 years now. So, and I wouldn't change that.
Thank you, Jon. So such a great journey. Thanks very much for sharing that. If I can please request Mark Palmer to please say a brief introduction.
Hello, I'm Mark Palmer. I'm the Digital Accessibility Lead at the Scottish Government. How did I get into accessibility? Probably accidentally. Same as anyone else. I've been a tester. I moved into being a developer, and I'm trying to think when, probably around about 2005, I picked up a book called a book about web standards by a guy called Dan Cederholm, and I was really just interested in that from a development perspective. But it brought to my attention that there were things that you could do with web standards that would make things work for people with disabilities. And that kind of fascinated me. I worked for a major bank at the time, and I ended up leaving that bank and going into work in a consultancy where I was the accessibility specialist. So I kind of forged my own path into that. I made myself an accessibility consultant on the back of that, basically, which was a bit of a shock on the first day, because I wasn't an accessibility consultant. I was just a guy that was quite into accessibility, but I was blagging it. And so I continued to blag it for quite a few years. And I work now with Kevin White, who runs Accessibility Scotland. And I think probably the first 2 years were essentially boilerplating and cutting up old reports that he had done and trying to pass that off as my own, but learning, as I went from what had gone before me. So I went on to work within that consultancy. I worked on major projects. I worked on BBC iPlayer, where I discovered that the BBC iPlayer volume goes up to 11, which I thought was brilliant, and it still does. I've just checked, and so a little Spinal Tap nod. And I worked at 4OD. I wrote some internal accessibility guidelines for the civil service in Abu Dhabi. I did various things before leaving to become a civil servant, where I worked at Registers of Scotland as an accessibility and usability specialist. And the accessibility specialist is not king in a world that is essentially map based. So I moved to Scottish Government in about 2018, and I've been there ever since. I previously worked in the Social Security Programme, which is where I met Sowmya. Yeah, I'm now back in core Scottish Government as the accessibility lead in a team of, there's now 3 accessibility specialists, and we have 2 user researchers working with us as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks very much, Mark. And finally, Paul Alexander, please, if you could share an introduction.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Alexander, as has already been stated. I don't quite have the storied career that the other gentlemen have on this call, but I started off working in financial services, working in various different roles, and then, much like everybody who ever ends up working in testing, you stumble into that arena and suddenly you've got a career. So I started testing in the bank and looking at different bits and pieces from that perspective. But it was when I moved into an agency setting that accessibility became something at the forefront of my brain. I've always I've always had a thing in my character where I feel like people should be included. That's always been sort of a part of who I am. And then being able to then see that sort of as a technical function, so to speak. There's technical aspects, there's soft aspects, things we can discuss later. But to bring that in, it then sort of the dots kind of connected for me, and it kind of gave me a bit more of a passion and a drive for what I was doing. And from there, when I was working in agencies, I helped write sort of inclusive design propositions, and helped doing accessibility audits and all the like from there. I think, you know, to sort of mirror John's story, my mother's high tone deaf, and I always remember being younger, having to sit for a while we'd got a new telephone, trying to find the right ringtone that my mum could hear, or if we changed the doorbell, making sure that she could hear that as well. Even daft things like the buzzer on the cooker. If the buzzer on the cooker wasn't right, then my mum wouldn't know that the stuff in the oven was on fire. So we had that at an early age, and as I say, I think that sort of bled through. I'm now head of QA at X Design, and as I say, my focus has always been a bit of a user-centric focus, trying to take a quality first mindset, but focusing within the user and without getting too sort of gushy about it, making sure that user has a sense of belonging. It's a sort of cross section where if you belong, then you're going to get something out of that product. It's that sort of cross section between inclusion, diversity, and equity traditionally, and I think those are the things that really have sort of piqued my interest and kept me going in this area. I think it's about helping people, and that's a slightly rambly introduction to who I am, and I apologize for that.
No, not at all. I think it was great to hear about your journey in accessibility. And I have to say, perhaps my trigger for getting into this topic is the fact that my uncle, my late uncle, he's no more, unfortunately, was severely learning disabled. And from very first-hand early years, you know, I saw a lot of challenges and barriers. I come from India, where the stigma around disability, particularly around anything that's more cognitive side, has a big element of you know, kind of shame and a lot of discrimination that comes with it. So I experienced a lot of it firsthand. Thankfully, my father's family was really forward looking. They tried to give my uncle the best opportunities to, you know, kind of enjoy life and be in the community, which was really lucky for him. But I saw many people around me who were never had that privilege, if you like. So yeah, I think I did kind of often wonder, but the real opportunity started when I started work in Soprest area, where there was an initiative for accessibility, and that drove me into networking with people who are into accessibility, and now coming into TI testing. Again, we are trying to build a strong service around accessibility. That's really given me an opportunity to go out and speak to a number of you, and all four individuals on this panel, as it happens, I've met them through similar connections, and what privilege it is. I find myself very fortunate to have crossed paths with all of them. Without further ado, I think we should get the panel discussion.
I think unless I'm imagining Sue, I think she's definitely part of the panel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Put an introduction.
So please, would you like
everybody
to
else can see Sue, right? It's not just not just something that's happening to me.
Definitely there.
and hopefully now you can hear me too, so that's all right.
Can, so there you go.
Well, you know, I am conscious of the fact that time is pressing. We're moving on a bit, but yes, I've obviously been in. Well, say obviously. For those of you that know me, I have been in testing for an awful long time. Love it to bits, and I've never quite understood why we had all these differentiations, why we have to have things described as being accessibility. To me, it's all about the one thing that all of us should be able to use the products, and whether that's you know, using them, well, just everyone should be able to use it. We now end up dividing it into this idea of usability with the extension in terms of accessibility, so as the conversation becomes easier. But I've been interested in usability and accessibility added together as getting people to be able to work with products for as long as I've been interested in testing, because and software development, because all of us will experience something as we go through life. I currently wear glasses. I didn't have to wear glasses. I now wear glasses, and trying to use products that weren't designed around that mean you have to adapt in some way. So it's a fascinating topic that is very close to my heart for all sorts of reasons, but conscious of the time, I shall leave those for another day. So thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Indeed, that's something I would have missed. Great to hear about your thoughts. So thanks very much. Right. I think moving on to the next leg of our session today, I would like to now bring up the screen to show the latest Mentimeter poll. If you can give me a moment, please. Right, I hope you can all see the current rating on the topic that we'll be looking to discuss today. The first one is actually, very interestingly, it's the one which goes, why is web accessibility not considered a priority in many business domains, and how can we improve it? I think an eternal topic perhaps, but I'd be quite keen to know what you all think about it. There's a very, very obvious case for accessibility, and there's yet a battle to be fought, no matter which domain you are in, to make a case for web accessibility. Maybe I'll request Jon to come in with any thoughts. Why do we still have this problem?
Sure. I struggle with this a bit, having sort of seen the journey that we've been through over the last 20 years, like looking at how much of the web was inaccessible back in sort of 2005. I think the DRC did a sort of an assessment and estimated that somewhere around 99.9% of all websites were inaccessible. And if you look at something like the WebAIM million now, we're looking at somewhere between 95 and up to 99% of websites still having, you know, issues on the homepage. And it's really gutting to think that we haven't actually moved forward very much in the last 20 years. So there's got to be a reason for that. And in my experience, I think it comes down to a lack of awareness rather than a lack of intent. There's often intent in organizations. It's that I believe often the talent is missing from certain teams, and it is a team sport. I guess I'm going on to answer a different question potentially, but it needs everybody to be bought in and working together towards making things more accessible. So I think that lack of embedded knowledge within teams, you know, ideally, of course, we wouldn't have accessibility specialists like ourselves. We would have everybody doing work towards making products and services more accessible online. So I think that's one thing. I'm also a believer that the way that we think of accessibility from a conformance perspective, and of course, as you know, very closely tied to testing, of course, is that I feel that conformance-led mindsets lead to incorrect expectations to how accessibility works. So I feel that if we have a conformance-led mindset, then we frame accessibility as an end goal, something that's achievable. And I personally don't think that accessibility or a fully accessible product is achievable, what we need, because that implies that there is a solution that solves everybody's needs and preferences, and fits everybody. There is no one size fits all. So this is why I believe that in accessibility as a practice, as a skill, as a quality of the work that we do, not as a something that's sort of led by conformance. So I think that some of the reasons that organizations get into thinking about accessibility is because it's, oh, are we conformant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? We don't know where to start, which is another problem. If they do know anything about accessibility, then very often they don't know where to start, which is why we end up with things like accessibility audits, which produce a report and perhaps tell you how to fix those things, but either the fixes don't make sense because they don't have the knowledge or adequate knowledge in the team, or it just feels really overwhelming. So what happens? Things might end up in an issue tracker somewhere and get backlogged. So we don't get to that sort of endpoint. So I still think that that's a mindset that organizations use, not all, but yeah, that's kind of why I think we see that. I think there was also part of the question was, how can we improve it? Well, I believe that we need to see more teaching of accessibility and mentoring teams of all sorts in accessibility skills, and in related topics at like university, and like things like computer science degrees and web courses. You know, we see there's a lot of web courses about now that have accessibility built into them, or are all about accessibility. And now, you know, we've got the IAAP certifications as well and things like that, which we didn't used to have. So there's progress being made, but I think we need more of those things, education and outreach, to make accessibility, just for lack of a better way of putting it, the norm.
Fantastic. So many amazing points, John. Couldn't agree more. Yeah, we have a real issue in accessibility becoming a specialist niche topic, and not everybody's responsibility. It sits with some individuals, as it were, and how would they possibly make that happen everywhere and more prevalent? Mark, please, if you would like to come in with your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably come in. I mean, I agree with everything John says, first of all. I'll probably come in from a different angle. I'll probably come in for why it's a problem in public sector, and that kind of leads on to why it's a problem in the private sector as well, because there are a lot of similarities, not necessarily in the amount of money that we have to spend or however, but often, certainly in public sector, we tend to buy products off the shelf. We don't tend to develop in-house, because if you developed in-house, then your chances of making anything accessible is probably significantly higher, because you have the complete control. The problem that we have in public sector, and I assume to a larger extent in private sector, is the market's not mature enough. So you could go out and do a procurement exercise, and often, certainly with some of the things that we're doing, if I think of social security, we're looking for very niche products, and what you might be then left with is you might be left with trying to procure the least worst product in terms of accessibility, because the marketplace is not there, and the marketplace isn't at that level of maturity. And the reason it's not getting to that level of maturity is because we keep buying this stuff. We will buy it regardless. And, you know, and it's not just public sector, but I imagine this happens in private sector as well, is that we don't hold people to promises that they make when it comes to when they submit tenders. We just don't. You know, we get to a point where it's delivered now, and there's some mythical phase 2, or it's on the product roadmap. And so as a result, the marketplace never matures, because people will continue to buy garbage. And that is the fact, because there is only garbage to buy. You can't not buy garbage if there's only garbage in the market. And that's the biggest frustration I have on a daily basis, is that, you know, I am continually faced with second-rate products that have been procured because there is nothing else to buy. Now, when you get into that space where you're looking at things like design agencies and so on, you can have a wee bit more influence over them, because they've probably got an in-house developer, they've probably got in-house test teams, they've probably got people that actually are concerned with doing a good job. The problem with like a large, like lumbering product, if you think of imagine a huge case management system or content management system, is usually there's maybe over a decade of development there, and trying to unpick all of that and actually make it accessible is a thankless task. So in terms of public sector, we need to start being more stringent on validating that what people say in tenders are true, and that's probably the same in the public sector as well. And we need to hold people to their commitments. And I think once we start doing that, and it's very difficult, certainly within Scottish government, because we don't have the buying power that somebody like the US government would have, or even the UK government. But until the people stop buying from the marketplace because accessibility isn't prioritised, until that happens, until accessibility is prioritised, until we get a handle on that, accessibility won't be prioritised, and that kind of concerns me a little bit. And I'll stop talking now and I'll let somebody else join in.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's a fantastic point made. The lack of governance and lack of accountability. It's a massive part of the problem, and I agree. There's this entire issue of how there's a market for products with poor accessibility, which means there's no incentive for people who are making these products to go out there and make an effort to build accessible products. So
we often act like we work in an ideal world where everybody's building everything from scratch. We can have that one-to-one conversation, but often we're just building and we're just installing and badging a product, and there is no control. And often, even myself as an accessibility specialist, I don't have direct contact with the people who might make the difference, because a layer of account managers and sales directors and everything there's this buffer zone that you can't penetrate. So yeah, that's a real frustration for me. Yeah,
fully understand and agree. Can relate to where you're coming from. The massive procurement process sometimes fails to stop a bad product from entering your domain, and once it has, the kind of the process to go backwards, is a very difficult one. It becomes a big financial decision, and then it puts off everybody from making that big call about, we don't want this product anymore, we want something more accessible. So yeah, absolutely, there are big business drivers behind why these things end up in the first place. Thank you, Mark. Paul, do you have any thoughts on this topic you would like to share, please?
Yeah, so I'm coming from a slightly different angle because I'm in a digital agency, so I am in that sort of area that Mark's saying where we have slightly more influence over what we're trying to build. For me, the biggest blocker we have is legacy systems, and I think that's kind of what people are touching upon there. Is things that pre-exist, retrofit things is where cost is massive. If you've built it from scratch with the right principles behind it, and you've got the best practice in there, it can be iterated upon and all these sort of things. But what we're 9 times out of 10 working with is a legacy system where we're trying to iterate upon something that's already not at the standard we would expect. So that's where the cost element comes into. But I think there is also an element when, certainly, as I say, from my side of it, there's an element of how we frame things when we're speaking to prospective clients and when we're trying to win business. So, for example, some people will react to the human element of it. So tapping into that empathy and saying, if you want this to be the best quality product you can have, these are the things we have to take into consideration, and you have to do a bit of upfront work in terms of scoping out your product, doing user research, making sure that you've got your like basically things like personas and things like that, making sure that we've got the right spectrum of things to anchor this to, because a lot of times when you're building these things, we lose focus on it, because once we get into sprints and we get into different bits and pieces, we're focused on delivering those individual increments, those little functions, those components here and there. If you don't have that bit at the start, you don't have something to anchor it back to. But it's about also explaining to, if you're dealing with somebody who's a bit more monetary focused, it's about framing it from that. Now, we don't want to dehumanize accessibility, because that's one of my big bugbears, is about checklist culture and all the other bits and pieces that take away the focus from being a person. It brings it back to being individual elements, and it means you're not thinking about solving an issue for a person. You're solving an issue to tick a box, and that's not the way we should be approaching it. So, but if you are going to be dealing with decision makers that are more financially driven or numbers driven, things like that, leveraging things like the purple pound and talking about the money that you could potentially be missing out on in terms of a target market and stuff like that. Now, obviously, it's a really crass and vulgar way of using the purple pound. I'm going to be frank with you, but sometimes it's the sort of thing that speaks to other people. And we talk about diversity, we talk about making sure that we're seeing things through different people's lenses. Some people's lenses are money driven, and you have to try and almost sell accessibility with that in mind. The other point that we tend to try and make to people when we're doing this early on is that you can either, I mentioned earlier on that little bit of upfront effort where you work with product and UX to try and come up with things that'll have a bit of longevity, that, as Mark sort of alluded to earlier, if you have that roadmap to build upon. Now, not everybody has that opportunity to build on. That roadmap sometimes is mythical, as Mark put, but if you can frame it in the way that you explain to them that little bit of upfront effort will save you budget later on having to retrofit, because as we sort of look back around on the original thing, those legacy systems, those retrofitting of things, those are the things where you burn money. This is where you're sitting there going, right, well, I've got to unpick all of this technical architecture. I've got to pull all this back, and I've got to refactor all this code. This isn't where we want to live. We essentially go through the redesign process while still having to work within a limited framework. Let's get this right from the start. If we can start on the right foot, when we do then try and expand and then bring it out into more, we're working from a place where we've already built on best practice. If we build it based on, let's just get this out the door, are we doing the best we can do? No. So I think that while I totally understand Mark's frustrations having to take these garbage products, to use his own words, and have to try and smoosh that square peg into the round hole to make it accessible for people. Coming from my side of it, where we deal with different clients and we're trying to work it, for us there is resistance from clients because they see it as this expense. There's a fallacy that accessibility and inclusive design is new, right? The first WCAG standards were like 1994. It's not. This is not new. One of my favorite quotes, and I can't remember who said it, but a friend said it to me, was, "The web is 100% accessible. It's the decisions we make afterwards that make it inaccessible." So first of all, accessibility is not new. It's been around forever, right? For as long as there's been internet, there's been accessibility. I've lost my train of thought. The second point I was going to go to, and was clearly glorious, but I've lost it. So I'm, essentially, false economy was, I think, where I was going with it. You either spend a little bit of time making sure you're doing the right thing for the right reasons to then save later on, because it is painful later on. And I think one thing that also gets lost when people are talking about it in business terms is people with disabilities, people with impairments, once they find something that works, they tend to stick with it. They are the archetypal repeat customer. And if you are driving any revenue from your web services, whether that be through a service or whether that through advertising, and you need foot traffic and stuff like that, your users with impairments, if you have the right service for them, they will be coming back. And that'll then drive your revenue, and that's where you then increase those profits. I hate talking in those terms. I'm only saying it because it's a slightly different slant on it. For me, it is about that sort of making sure that as many people as possible can use it without as barrier free as possible. But sometimes if we're talking about businesses, we have to frame it slightly differently because their priorities are different. Some are user-centric and focused on their end users. Some are bottom line profit margins. So if you're having to deal with people that are profit margins, you have to just talk their language and you have to relate it that way. So I think that is what we have to do, is when we are trying to bring people on board, we have to shape the conversation based on that. Now, sometimes that takes a little bit of relationship building in the early stages before you get into pitch stage and things, but it's about doing the right thing and it's about getting there. Otherwise, if you don't get in the room, we're going nowhere, is the way I would put it. Now I'm going to mute because I feel like I've talked for a long time there.
So absolutely a brilliant point. Not that you have to, but you kind of sometimes bring that commercial element to the fore to make a case for accessibility. It's a very unfortunate reality, and it's still seen as an impediment, and it kind of really makes you feel awful when you hear these things. And leave the ethical side alone. The fact that some of the things like search engine optimization is so much better if your website is accessible. If your website is well designed, you're likely to have less calls to your customer support service. You'll be saving money. And really, as something that's very accessible, that feature is likely to benefit people who don't have disability too. So it really, accessibility really is well beyond the idea of addressing people with disability. It is for everyone. And it's a shame when you are compelled to have to make a case for it and really fight for it. But perhaps that needs to be done in a way that you're suggesting, Paul, that you raise awareness with your customers to say, you have to think about it and really, really help them understand the value of it. Thank you, Paul. I'll request David to come in, please, on this topic.
Not sure there's much left I can say. I was just going to sort of pile on to the whole business side of mostly, like, the private sector is mostly interested in return on investment, if I'm taking the question very literally. And because there's no accountability for it in the UK, there is very little incentive for them to make accessibility priority because it's an extra cost, and there's very little proof for them that it's going to have any real benefit, any financial benefit to them, depending on what their industry is. Might be none as far as they're concerned, but there is, although there is the Equalities Act there is a negligible chance of any legal action being taken against them. Whereas in America, you've got ambulance chasing lawyers suing anyone for any minor Section 508 violation, which is not the culture you want, but it does make people go out and check their website. So I mean, I agree with what everyone else has said, but I don't think there's much else I can add to it.
Absolutely, fully agree, David. There's a whole legislation angle, and yeah, possibly a very kind of a regional thing. I haven't seen a big culture of legislation within the UK. As you said, perhaps the US has had a big culture.
Yeah, I mean, there is accountability in the public sector, but the private sector, unless they get the same type of people checking the quality of their sites, they've got no motivation to do anything about it.
Absolutely.
And certainly, I mean, I found that all throughout my career, is all the virtually every private sector company, the only thing they cared about was the costs. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the kind of the business world, as sometimes as ruthless as it can get, is all about profits and margins, and somewhere that the cause of accessibility is completely lost, possibly to their detriment, not that they realize it, very quickly. So anything you'd like to share before we move on to the next topic?
Well, it's not so much adding to what's been said, because it's all, I totally agree with the points that have been raised, but I was interested in, John, your idea around not having specialists around accessibility. In my experience, I've found on projects, if you don't have somebody that has a specialism, or you could say being that area championing, so an accessibility champion, then the impetus gets lost very quickly. Various projects that I've worked on, my speciality areas, if you like, are performance testing and usability, pushing into the accessibility areas, as I said earlier on. And if you don't have somebody on the team who considers that to be their area of specialism or passionate area, then the whole thing just peters out. So your thoughts around not having specialists.
I
was interested on that one.
It should clarify. My point was that it's everybody has a role to play in accessibility. So I completely know where you're coming from, and I think accessibility champions. In any meeting that happens, there should be somebody there representing accessibility. My point is, if everybody is aware of accessibility and knows how it affects their work, then that becomes more unnecessary. Okay, somebody should still be an accessibility champion and speak up on behalf of accessibility. And sure, some different people have different levels of knowledge. So somebody, right now, if there's an accessibility champion in a team, they're the go-to person for accessibility. That's great. Somebody else may be an expert in performance or something like that. That works. But most developers, for example, and it's not just about development teams, but most developers will know something about performance. But I almost guarantee that not many on a team know as much about accessibility. So that was kind of my point, that if everybody had a little bit of a role to play in accessibility, then ideally we wouldn't need people specializing. But I do agree with you that somebody needs to be, perhaps that comes with accountability as well. Somebody needs to be accountable for it, and somebody needs to be the person in the room speaking up for it.
Fantastic, thank you. This actually nicely segues into another topic that's been rated quite heavily, which is around, does accessibility benefit from a top-down approach better, where management is influencing the teams to implement accessible UI, or the other way around? Actually, it's rated same as what can we do to improve awareness about accessibility in project environments? How can education be imparted mandatorily? My own personal favorite is the first one, the one about should we have a top-down approach or not? Is panel okay if we take that up for discussion, please? Because I feel it's an eternal challenge. Who drives this? Is it management telling build accessible products, or people owning the product for building and say, let's make this accessible and build the value to the management layer to say, look, this is why you should have accessibility in place. Who wants to go first? Mark, any thoughts?
So I don't think either is an entire solution in itself. I think certainly in my career, most of the drive for accessibility comes from the bottom. It certainly in an actual sense of understanding it properly tends to come from the bottom. I find that developers, testers usually have the greatest interest in it. Somebody who's at a senior management level who might be implementing, some kind of governance, maybe doesn't necessarily understand what's involved, doesn't necessarily have the interest, and really just is looking for somebody to sign that off for them and say that it's been done. I think driving it from the bottom and driving it from the minute that somebody comes into the organization, right from an induction course, right through their day-to-day awareness sessions on a regular basis. It should be part of mandatory training. And I've never lifted a box in my life in the office, but I seem to be given, and every year I seem to learn how to lift a box without putting my back out. But we don't seem to have any kind of mandatory training on how we build accessible experiences for our customers or for our internal colleagues. So I think all of that is really key. It's not just about a project level. I think it's at an organizational level that everybody should work to make sure that there's that awareness. I don't know how many organizations I've been in where there's an HR team who apparently do workplace adjustments. There's an IT team that will potentially provide assistive technology, but God forbid if you ever actually have an issue with that assistive technology, because the IT team doesn't do it enough, and the HR team, it's not their responsibility, right? So there are all those. We have all these little silos that exist in organizations who have some kind of responsibility for organizations or for accessibility for disabled people, but they all need to pull together. But in a project, I think it has to be driven from at least product owner level. If the product owner doesn't buy into it, then the product owner doesn't prioritize accessibility work, because they will always, a product owner's natural drive is to prioritize function, because you're measured against what functionality you drive. You're never going to spend an entire sprint developing something that to anybody that's not disabled just looks exactly the same as what you put out the last sprint, right? So you've got to get buy-in at that level, and having management above who are aware and who insists on it. I don't think that's as powerful as making sure that the people that are actually doing the job have that awareness, have that understanding of how what they do impacts other people.
But it's also got to be the customer, who are we building these products for? That where they come into the process, where we're defining the requirements. That in my head, it's coming in the middle of these two areas, because if we're defining the requirements, we're working with the clients, we're working with the customers to see what it is that they need to do the job, to get this product that we're building out to the client to get the value from it. And if the client is also aware of accessibility and can see the benefit of it, then they can feed it into the process in between both of these areas, that everybody is then aware of what we need to be building.
Such fantastic perspectives. Absolutely. It's perhaps to be done from all different levels. Anything from your experience that stands out, Jon? Is it important to have strong stakeholders who will make sure nobody kind of gets away from it, or as Sue says, a customer demand to build accessible products, or maybe the team says, let's build an accessible product?
So part of my career has been working with on subcontract for other organizations that work in digital accessibility, working for some pretty large companies. Others have been working on much smaller companies. And certainly find in larger organizations, it's come from a product owner kind of, or somebody in a product team wanting to make sure that somebody's getting the training. So a sort of a middle management kind of level. But in other organizations, you'll just like Mark said, you'll see it that it's gone in under the radar. And one story that sticks in my mind is where a couple of people on a team were putting together, building something with accessibility in mind and putting together resources to help other teams do so. And then they open sourced it, and then they won an award. And to which point the management went, what's this award that we've just won? And what have you been up to? And suddenly they got funding. And it became something that the organization was very proud of and did well, actually. So, you know, the kind of ripple effect, wherever the intent comes from, whether it comes from customers who are, you know, perhaps a more values-led organization that go, okay, well, we haven't, because like I rarely find myself in a C-suite meeting, but if I were, I would hazard a guess that very rarely the word accessibility comes up. Maybe our users or the people that are using our product might be thought of as a group, and maybe we might try and sector them in some way or categorize them in some way. But you know, in reality, we know that users don't work like that. Yes, we can try and section them up. But anyway, the point is accessibility. Some organizations may well want to put it in their sort of procurement policies that something needs to be accessible. If they're the kind of organization that are looking at things like disability confident employers and that sort of thing, then they you know, looking for something, if it doesn't turn up on somebody's requirements list, then organization or vendors aren't going to sort of build for it. But like Mark said earlier, surely all the government or like public sector contracts that go out or proposals, you know, have requirements around accessibility. So somebody might say, oh, we want something to be accessible, but then vendors sort of don't fulfill that. And yeah, it's so I guess that is less effective in some ways, that there's a kind of a get out clause. How do you build accountability into that? And well, I think I know of a couple of organizations I've worked with who have said, well, our software vendor have said that it's going to be accessible and it's not. And I'm like, well, that's surely in the contract somewhere. That's a breach of it's not providing fit services that are fit for purpose. So the organizations have said to me, okay, well, we need to sort of live out this contract, then we're looking for the next thing. But there's then that legacy, you've got legacy software that you are so reliant on it that the migration from one piece of software to another is another absolute headache. So, these are complex issues that are ingrained in other aspects of how businesses run, that it's not just a case sometimes of saying we need to fix the accessibility problem. In a way, I guess what I'm saying is I feel like it's better in some ways if it can be top down, but equally it doesn't matter where it comes from as long as it gets done. And then at some point, hopefully everybody's singing from the same song sheet.
Absolutely. Very well said, John. Perhaps, yes, indeed. No matter which part of the organization is making a strong case for accessibility, really wish we kind of get into a space of everybody owning it, not just the management or the people who are building the product, but really everybody's participating. I do agree with the view that top down sometimes has a lot of impact in getting that compliance, because it comes from a place of authority and it can have a higher power. But right, so maybe or to Paul, what do you think, Paul? Who's perhaps best to influence accessibility to be made reality?
So for me, accessibility is fueled by sort of diversity and collaboration. So the reality is a top-down approach, going sort of traditionally, if somebody tells you what to do, unless you understand the why, you might end up being a bit resistant. I personally think that people are more invested if they are the ones, or at least they feel like they are the ones that are empowered to make these decisions and take it forward themselves. If this is a decision that's being made by someone else, are you really bought into something you're being told to do? Or are you going to do this properly because it's something you actually care about? And I think that it's more effective when it comes from the lower down in the chain. Realistically, hierarchies to these things, again, there'll be people who will do their job, and that means they'll do the bare minimum. And is that what we want in accessibility? We want a bare minimum standard being met. No, we want people to actually be invested in that and take it forward. And as I say, the best way for me is for that to be from the ground, and as I say, as a collaborative process, because that way you get different insights, you get different people saying different things. To touch on a couple of points that the guys have mentioned there, and again, obviously I'm coming from a different standpoint here, but if you have accessibility baked into your development, like this is your development standards, this is what you're going to do within your development standards, and it's part of your design frameworks and things like that, the client's never going to know, right? I know it sounds like a really ridiculous thing because we've been talking about money and the extra cost of accessibility and things like that. But if that becomes part of your everyday process and that just becomes your standard, the client's never going to know. And if you look at some of the greatest products in history, they were built for people with disabilities and have been adopted by everyone in everyday life, and everybody's forgotten their origins. You look at things like SMS text messaging, like, for example, that was created for people who couldn't interact with a phone in the traditional way. Yeah, the keyboard. I think there's a slight myth around the origins of the keyboard, but I quite like it. I'm going to chuck it out there. The keyboard, the first sort of, obviously the keyboard, word processor, typewriter, but the first precursor to the typewriter was invented by an Italian in either the 1600s or the 1700s. And it was because he was having an affair with an Italian countessa. And he created it because she didn't trust her handmaiden to transcribe things because she was blind. So he created this machine so that she could touch the keys and create these love letters that she could then seal and have sent off. And obviously somebody might read them on the way there, but she's not having to say these things audibly out loud for somebody to write them down, all these different things. So, you know, that was the supposed origin of the keyboard. And I think what I'm trying to get at here is that if you build things, you bake that into your baseline standards, you're going to create a great product. The people who are using it are probably not going to know that it's disability centric. Like even ridiculous things like look at shampoo and conditioner bottles. If you have a look at in your bathroom, right, shampoo has the cap at the top. It's probably a quite nicely designed bottle with a whole load of different lovely shapes on it. Your conditioner has it at the bottom and it's sharp pointy edges at the top. Has that affected anybody using shampoo and conditioner in their life? No, right? But for the person who's blind and reaching for a bottle and trying to figure out which one goes first, it's an absolute game changer. Does it cost a lot of money to come up with an idea like that? No. When they first put it out there, was it probably, you know, it's just a good idea. So what I'm trying to say is if you do things the right way, when you go to put things out there, it doesn't really matter whether the client wants accessibility or not to an extent if you have these things baked in and you have the buy-in at a ground level. So that's why I think I'm looping back round on it, this top-down approach. The top-down approach, quite often, as I think the guys have alluded to, is a business decision. Again, talking about money, is now talking about metrics, things like that. That's where a lot of top-down decisions come from because they've seen an issue and they're trying to remedy it from a business perspective. If you have people on the ground who are just taking pride in their work and doing the right things, and that's just the way we do things, it creates that better product. Obviously, that's blue sky thinking. That is not the case everywhere. It's not the easiest thing to implement, and I'm not turning around and saying that's the case everywhere. But I'm just more trying to drill a complex problem into a simple one. You shouldn't have pushback from clients because realistically, how you build things is not their concern. All they are concerned about is what they get at the end. If what they get at the end does what they want it to do, accessibility can come along with that, and they end up with a great product as opposed to a good one. I'll mute.
Fantastic. How brilliantly put, Paul. Absolutely. I think we all have that power in our hands to kind of make the difference if we really put all our thought behind it. David, anything you'd like to add to that, please?
I think there's much else you could add to that. I mean, the only way to me, it doesn't matter again where it comes from, whether it's top down or bottom up. But the only way you can ensure it's there is if you have someone who can basically say the product's not going out until a certain standard's met, so it has to go in the must-have category, which it just doesn't get most of the time. I mean, you could just have a persistent user that makes people take notice. Like all of Procter & Gamble's stuff, that was the accessibility for that was driven purely by one employee with a very persistent personality. It took her a few years, but they finally took notice and started changing their websites and their products. He's pretty much covered everything else, I think.
I think that's a fantastic point as well, David, that sometimes we need kind of people, or it need not be individuals, that roles that will safeguard interests of all of the user community. And sometimes when somebody stands their ground, it's heard world over. I'm afraid we run out of time. I would have actually happily carried on all evening talking about it, because I found the discussion so amazing and so many great points coming out. And really, we should do this often and with people around us, really spread the word. Really kind of be the voice and the champion and the advocates for accessibility in whatever capacity you can in your environments. With that, I'm afraid I will have to bring the session to a close. A big thank you to all our panelists for very kindly taking time, and all of the people who have joined us live. Thank you very much, and whoever's watching this in a recorded format, thank you so much for taking time to watch this session. I'm going to share the link for a very
He's muted,
from
Sowmya.
Scottish Testing Group. Sorry. We are going in person soon after a number of months of virtual events. Scottish Testing Group is very pleased to announce the first in-person event in a long time. It's been a while since we've done one of these. Really looking forward to this. It's going to happen on the 23rd of June in Edinburgh, featuring 3 amazing speakers, Andrew Brown, Charmaine Short, and Tracy Baxter. I've posted the link on the chat area. Please do look it up and please do register. It should be a great afternoon of amazing talks and an opportunity to network and meet people from similar workspace and similar wavelengths. So look forward to seeing all of you and many of you in that event. And yeah, thanks very much. Sue, anything that you would like to share before we bring the session to a close?
Just once again, big thanks to the panelists and to the attendees. So really great conversation. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
Wish you a
you.
good night.
Thanks for having
Cheers.
us.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.